You're listening to CinePunked, interactive discussions for film lovers. This episode, keep calm and carry on. So, as ever, I am your host, Robert J. Simpson. I am joined by Dr. Rachael Kelly.
Hello.
We're going to talk about Carry On today, which you're not massively fond of, are you?
Not a massive fan, however.
I do feel we're kind of torturing you a little bit in some of these recent...
I feel like this is still payback for The Room.
Everything we ever do from this point on is payback for The Room.
See, pretty much that's what I thought, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry for introducing you to like fantastic cinematic tragic nonsense, you know.
Nonsense be all right. Yeah. Ben is with us as per usual, recording and doing all our producing stuff, but he's going to be very, very quiet today. He's decided he wants a day off because he's still suffering from having mentioned The Room. And we are very lucky today. We are joined by Britain, the world's foremost comedy expert, Mr. Robert Ross.
Thank you, Robert. That's very kind of you to say so. I'm glad to be here. It's very exciting.
A man whose books I've actually bought.
Well, bless you. Tonight we eat. That's very kind of you.
I mean, Rachel's got books too, but I didn't buy those.
No, buy my books.
In fact, one of them you refused to give to me because it's I still haven't got your...
There's definitely one. There's definitely one waiting for you somewhere. Yes.
But yeah, no, Rob's books I've actually bought on occasion.
I did sign them for free though, I think, didn't I? So I think I've signed a couple.
I'm not even sure if I've got any of your books.
You've got the rare unsigned copy.
Yeah,
my
they're
God,
worth more.
They are. They're priceless. Those. I sign anything. I don't care. I've got no shame whatsoever.
Checks, bar
bills.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Bar bills mainly. Yeah.
Yeah, you've done that. So we're going to start this. First thing to talk about, I guess, is the perception of the Carry On films, because I think people have a very clear idea about what a Carry On is. Now, as the one person in the room who's maybe not a fan, I'm going to ask you, Rachel, first, what your perception is of the Carry On.
You see, this is the thing. Because when we said we were doing Carry On, I immediately thought of Ooh Matron and Barbara Windsor's bra pinging off, and I just got this rather weary
That's it,
sense.
basically, yeah. No.
Yeah, and I was like, oh, okay, fine, I'm still getting tortured for The Room. Fine, I'll watch the Carry On. Then I sat down and watched Sergeant, and I hadn't seen Sergeant before. And I thought, gee, this is actually kind of gentle and sweet. That's not what I was expecting. Now, yeah, there were a couple of dirty jokes and a couple of bits where I rolled my eyes and went, yeah, that's pretty much what I was expecting. And then I thought, this is an anomaly. So then I watched Carry On Nurse, and that's even sweeter. That's really quite lovely. And there's lots of lovely people becoming in love and very, very little sort of tits and knob jokes. And I thought, but have I got this completely wrong? But apparently, talking to you guys, that's kind of standard for the early ones.
Well, I think people forget they were a 20-year run of films. If you don't count Columbus, which we will discuss, I'm sure, which was the sort of the orphaned Carry On that came along 14 years after the series came to an end in 1978. But there were 30 films in that 20-year period. So, you know, they did reflect the shifting sands of social awareness and culture. So, you know, the very early ones, the first 6 were written by a guy called Norman Hudis. Now, Norman Hudis was a wonderfully sort of socialist, feminist sort of person who would try and drop in sort of social stuff all the time and try because his wife was a nurse, Rita, his wife was a nurse, and he was, you know, trying to battle against the fact that when she was a nurse, a trainee nurse, she had to get back to the dormitory by 10 o'clock because, you know, matron would sort of like, you know, dock her some money and this sort of stuff. And they treated nurses like, you know, children, really. So he would always try and drop in some sort of challenging stuff within all the sort of the innuendo of the carry-ons. But they were more risque than any other films at that time. If you look at the sort of the Norman Wisdom films or in the Doctor in the House films, even those very early carry-ons had a lot more innuendo in there. But they were more, I always class them more like an Ealing comedy. There's a sort of good community to them. They're like a gang of people, and it doesn't matter about class or gender or sexuality. They're all part of that gang. So, you know, Kenneth Connor and Sid James and Kenneth Williams are all mucking in together to make, you know, something happen. So if you're looking at Carry On Sergeant, you're battling, you know, William Hartnell, but there's a barrack room of misfits. They all sort of get together and you know, become brilliant squaddies at the end of the film, and it's a real sort of community feel to those early Carry-Ons. As you say, they're sweet and they're always very joyously written and joyously played.
See, that makes a lot of sense to me, what you're saying about Norman Hudis. That I didn't know any of that, but when I'm thinking back to watching it, that really, there's a real feel of that there of trying to reclaim something.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about them being like Ealing comedies, yeah, I mean, screwball comedy would have been what came to mind when I was watching it. There's, you know, I find it hard even to remember any direct innuendo. I mean, the closest risque thing I can think of is when they're, that fairly predictable sequence where they're trying to consummate their wedding night and they keep banging on the door of Sergeant Grimshaw's bed and they're going to climb into bed beside. They didn't even climb into bed beside him. It was all very innocent and sweet and lovely, and and then
there's one line in it which is a belter of a joke where it's basically Norman Rossington who's the squaddy that's failed everything for years and years.
Oh
and years.
Yes, I love that line.
He goes, "Here's me excuse marching chit, me excuse webbing chit," and Kenneth Connor says, "Blimey, you're just a heap of chits."
Yeah.
Now even for later Carry On stand, and that's pretty risque comedy, to do a shit joke in 1958 was pretty bold. But they would have to battle with the censor. And Peter Rogers, the producer, would always tell me that they would put in some jokes they know would get cut because they'd start bargaining then. So, okay, well, if we lose that one, then can we keep that one? And we lose those two, can we keep that even dirtier one? And they would do that, and it was a game they would play. But those early films did have those sort of those battles with the censor. But that became the blueprint of what Carry On was. It became just wonderfully smutty jokes, but it was all sort of pinched from music hall routines, really, and vaudeville sketches and that sort of thing. But I mean, there was some, as I say, they were really cleverly written. Those first six that Norman Hoodis wrote, they really were. Not to decry the later films, I think Todd Rothwell did a brilliant job to really reheat a load of sort of smutty jokes that had been done to death in other films and other music hall sketches. But those first six have got a very special place in my heart because they are done with such care and social consciousness, which really adds to the value of the films, I think, as a piece of work to look back on.
They're very different. I mean, they sit so. I think I said to you before we did this that for me they're more like satires at times.
Yeah,
there's something else in this kind of commentary. But Sergeant sort of comes out of a completely different world. I mean, there's no idea at that point that this is going to become a series.
Absolutely not. No.
It fits into that nice little world of sort of wartime comedies. Mm-hmm. That are very much part and parcel, and
sure.
This apparently came from an idea about a ballet company.
Yeah, well, to put it into context, I mean, because don't forget, it was only 13 years since the end of the Second World War, which isn't long at all. You think back to 2006, which seems like yesterday to me.
That's never 13 years ago.
Exactly, it's crazy, right? So the end of the war. So people who went to see that film would have had relations who had been killed in the conflict, and certainly fathers and brothers and sisters who'd served in the conflict. And I think you're right when you say there was a glut of khaki comedies, I call them, late 50s stuff. So you've got Norman Wisdom in The Square Peg. You've got Private's Progress. The Bolton Brothers comedy with Ian Carmichael and Terry Thomas. You've got the most important influence on Carry On Sergeant, the classic ITV sitcom from Granada, The Army Game, which basically, Peter Rogers just made the unofficial film version of. Dragging in William Hartnell and Charles Hawtrey and Norman Rossington, and later in the Carry Ons taking Bernard Brezel from that series as well. And Hammer Films, as Robert will know, did an
official adaptation,
an official Army Game film called I Only Asked in the year after Carry On Sergeant in '59. So I mean, they were everywhere. You couldn't move for sort of comedians doing sort of either contemporary army comedies or reflecting sort of World War II stuff. It was a popular sort of genre. And again, I think people forget that Carry On Sergeant was instantly popular. It was number 3 in the British box office for 1958, beaten only by Bridge on the River Kwai and Dunkirk. So there was a sort of a real
bit of a trend there,
a real sort of but claiming that sort of that military history, and Carry On Sergeant was sat in that group of 3, just sort of like poking fun at it already. It was a gloriously well timed film. But you mentioned this ballet thing was based on a play that no one wanted to make. Called The Ball Boys by a guy called I.F. Delderfield, and Peter Rogers had bought the film rights to this thing, and it's okay, but it's they wanted originally Leslie Caron to be in it, playing the Shirley Eaton, which morphed into that part. She's a ballerina, and her dance partner, is called up to the army, and that's the split, and that's what happens. But it's very loosely based on the Ball Boys.
See, I mean, when I kind of first read that and came across that reference, I can almost picture a Carry On film about a ballet company. That certainly does sound like something they would do.
Absolutely.
But
starring Charles Hawtrey as the ballerina. Really fun, but
just as bad in this one.
That's the kind of the Carry On that I remember that I think about when I think about Carry On. And again, when the Charles Hawtrey character walks on screen in Carry On Sergeant, I did do a bit of eye rolling. Oh, here we go. We're going to start poking fun at sort of non-hegemonic performance of masculinity here. And they don't, though.
No.
Again, they don't. And Kenneth Williams is smarter than everybody on that. And it's actually quite a warm depiction of everybody.
Gerald Thomas, the director of all of the Carry Ons, all 31, he really pulls out some nice performances there. I think he got, not lazy as such, I wouldn't say that, but I think he just got into a bit of a sort of a rut, I suppose, where he would just wind up Kenneth Williams, with a key in his back and let him go. But in those earlier films, he does rein him in a bit and make him, give a good performance. And there's certain later films where he does the same. Carry On Cleo, although it's an outrageous performance, is beautifully, sort of Shakespearean in scope, and it's a well directed performance. Carry On Cowboy, where Kenneth Williams plays the Judge Burke, is another one where he's actually given a sort of character performance. Other times he's just, Gerald Thomas thinks, we need a good laugh here, so let Kenneth do the mad sort of face pulling and let Sid James put the laugh in.
But those later ones, I mean, it's much more the types have kind of come in, and this is where I think the perception is that by that point, those caricatures that they play, and if they're not playing a variation on that, we're a bit disappointed.
Well, Sid's last film, Carry On Dick, which is the Dick Turpin thing, I mean, the script's pretty thin anyway, but you can almost see Gerald Thomas just losing his rag with the whole concept of it, and he would, encourage Sid to use that laugh. And there's some atrocious dialogue in it, which just about gets away with it because Sid puts that laugh in, and you laugh because of the laugh. You don't laugh because of the joke. So by that point, they were just signifiers and almost like sort of catchphrases just thrown in to get the comedy across. But those early ones, I mean, they really were beautifully made and made on a relatively small budget. I think everybody thinks they were made for 2 and 6, but I mean, it cost £74,000, Carry On Sergeant, which isn't a lot, of course, but when you reflect that the films that Gerald Thomas and Peter Rogers were making even a year, 18 months earlier, they were making them for like £10,000 or £12,000. So in terms of what they were doing, that was quite a big budget film to get their hands onto, and its success, as I said, number 3 in the box office, almost automatically dictated another one would come around the corner. And the one, I loved Peter Rogers dearly, but he was a tricky fella. But I think the one moment of absolute genius he had was not to do another army film, but to retain Carry On, retain the cast, retain the script writer, retain Gerald Thomas as director, and then put it in a different situation. So then you've got the whole world at your disposal. You can do Carry On anything. I think he could have done another 2 or 3 military ones, and then it would just fizzle out by 1962. But the fact he did Carry On Nurse purely by the chance that he had another script that he couldn't get rid of, a thing called Ring for Catty that he got, that was a John Mills play in the West End. Patrick Cargill had co-written it, Jack Beale. And Peter Rogers bought the rights to make this film. Nobody wanted it, so he said, "Oh, we do Carry On Nurse. I've got this, script in my bottom drawer. We'll use that." So it was a lucky sort of gamble, but it paid off.
I suppose, really, when you're talking about the context in which these films arrive, what kind of strikes me about the humour is it's very much punching upwards in the earlier films, whereas my recollection of the films in the humour in the later films is kind of punching down. The caricatures in that become that little bit more brainless, and there's much less. I don't want to use sort of big fancy film studies words here, but much less agency afforded to certainly the women in the later ones, whereas these women are very much in. They're in control of the situation.
It's interesting. I agree with you to an extent. I mean, there's another Norman Hoodis film called Carry On Regardless, which is a sort of real curate's egg. It's about helping hands agency that does anything for anybody, really, if they're paid. But there's a line in that where basically they're all out of work, all the gangs in it, Kenneth Connor and Terence Longdon and Sid James, all those guys. And it's Liz Fraser's very first Carry On, and she's teamed up with Joan Sims in it. And there's a line when they're going to the unemployment agency, and there's a men's section and a women's section, and there's the line that says, "Well, I can do a man's job, and I will too as well." And there's little moments like that. You think, well, yeah, and the very fact they're in part of that gang. There are women in that gang, and the likes of Joan Sims and Hattie Jakes, who were brilliant, comedy actors, were given decent parts, which wasn't often the case in British films at that time. Certainly British television. You look at something like Monty Python. You know, they played the parts themselves, and they gave Carol Cleveland nothing. But the point is, they are perceived as a more intellectually, worthy comedy collective than the Carry On people. And I think the Carry Ons were just doing things purely by little sort of clever moments like that, little clever lines. Even a later film like Carry On Girls, which is a horrendously misogynistic film in great swathes of it, and the baddie, if you like, is June Whitfield as this almost like Mary Whitehouse figure trying to sort of stop this beauty contest happening. But the beauty contestants themselves aren't just silly dolly birds. The Barbara Windsors and the Margaret Nolans and the Valerie Leons. They've got some stuff to say. They've got some decent, quite feminist dialogue going on in there. But all wrapped up in this crazy 85-minute saucy postcard. So they do drop in those little moments, but people don't expect that, and so it comes as a surprise sometimes if you see these little things that pop up, because you think Carry On, it's just going to be tits and bums and trousers falling down, which it is a lot of the time, to be fair.
Daffodils and bum cheeks.
Exactly,
yes.
daffodils up bums, exactly. Yeah, which is beautifully referenced in Carry On Doctor 10 years later. If you watch Carry On Doctor with guest star Frankie Howard for the first time, there's a lovely scene when Frankie's in the hospital bed with his rear poking towards the ceiling, and the nurse comes in. Valerie Van Ost plays the nurse and comes in with this lovely vase of daffodils, and he says, "Oh no, don't do that. I saw that film." And it's like, God, they're referencing Carry On Nurse in Carry On Doctor. It's brilliant. It's just referencing the fact we're just making a load of crazy films here, and it's a lovely little intertextuality moment there.
Yeah, sort of sneaking in social commentary where you least expect it, kind of hiding it behind a bunch of knob jokes. That's very clever. It's much cleverer than I gave these films credit for, I have to say.
I knew we could sway you eventually.
Well, I've still, Carry On Camping and Carry On Cleo. Now that's one that I did have to look at. You're putting a face,
is that a problem?
Well, you
God,
see,
really?
now...
Come on, that's a glorious script.
So my sphere of expertise is films about Cleopatra.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
So...
I'm going to keep quiet this minute.
Yeah. I was focusing primarily on the historical epics, but I did need to watch kind of films that dealt with it in some way. And I think it's a really interesting way of dealing with it, for the fact that it inverts the Mark Antony and Caesar kind of dyadic relationship. Oh God, I'm full of these terms tonight. I apologise completely.
It's good.
I mean, it's a lovely juxtaposition for listeners who've tuned into this thing.
We're talking about the masculine dyad of Caesar, Mark Antony.
The spirit of Gerald Thomas is loving this, believe me, because he was a real cinephile, Gerald Thomas. So to be discussed in these terms, you'd be tickled pink, believe me. So yeah,
but then you have these. I can't for the life of me remember the actress who played Cleopatra.
Amanda Barry.
Thank you very much, Amanda Barry. How could I forget? And she's playing this sort of, and I do understand. I mean, that this is kind of referencing broader political context at the time in quite a clever way. Yeah. But at the same time, Cleopatra, one of the most phenomenally intelligent women to have ever ruled, particularly in her time, and she's being sort of reduced to this kind of ditzy sort of bug-eyed, isn't everything a bit too complicated for me? So I have endless issues with
No, it's true.
On
it's funny though, because it was written originally for Barbara Windsor to play, which would have been a very different performance to what Amanda Barry gives to the part. But it's interesting if you, which I have done, if you run it on the same day with Cleopatra, the Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra, which it was aping, obviously completely. It's so well done. It's such a clever spoof of that film. It's not designed to be historically, accurate, obviously, and it doesn't achieve that at all. But I'm treading on eggshells here. I'll be very careful. But as a filmic parody, it works really well. And I think in terms of the script, it's probably got more laughs or more jokes per minute than any of the others. And in terms of performances, as I mentioned before, Kenneth Williams is extraordinary in it. I think Charles Hawtrey
they've all got it
is just
wonderful.
Yeah,
of course.
Which it's a cliche now, but that was a line pinch from a radio show. But I always try and plug the fact it was written by Dennis Norden and Frank Muir rather than Tolly Rothwell, because Tolly did acknowledge it, but it's gone down in history as Tolly's line and the greatest one-liner of all time. But it was a line from a Jimmy Edwards radio show called "Take It From Here." But it's fun. But as I say, if that's your thing, I'm sure you're going to be cringing every time you see it. So I shall bow away from the mic.
To be fair, it's not the worst filmic adaptation of Cleopatra's story that I've ever seen.
Which is the worst, as a matter of interest?
Oh, there was a 1999 TV miniseries called Cleopatra, based on a really good book about her, but it's just called Cleopatra, and it's shockingly bad. It's just horrible.
And who played Cleo in that one? Cleopatra, sorry.
Oh, Leonore Varela.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to plug your book while you're here? So
Yeah.
we can read all about it?
Mark Anthony and Popular Culture by Rachael Kelly, available from all good bookshops.
I'm going to buy a copy of that. That sounds great. Seriously, no. I love all that, yeah.
One of the things about that first film is actually the characterization. I think it's rather wonderfully done. Everything is quite subtle, and rather than a lot of exposition, you kind of come in and these characters are all perfectly formed. Within a couple of seconds, you get a really good impression of Kenneth Williams' character. Just for the fact he's lying there lounging on that bed and it's totally disinterested.
Beautifully played. Yeah, he's probably one of his best performances, James Bailey. And it says James Bailey, BSc Economics.
Yes.
You're rank. That's a matter of opinion. And all that. I mean, it's really, really well done. I earned my degree, that sort of thing. You know,
Yeah,
it was given
that's
to me. I earned my degree, you know, and all that. And
line,
you think, God, this is cleverly done stuff.
Yeah.
You know, this is basically just bulking against authority and saying, look, we are men here. We shouldn't be doing this. We are different people thrown into this mad barrack room together. But by process of just getting on and getting the job done, they do achieve it, and they gel as a unit, and they gelled as a team of actors, and they gelled as a unit, you know, in that film. But don't forget, you know, once you jump into like film 4, when Sid James joins the gang, you've got the Tony Hancock's half-hour team pretty much back together. You've got Sid James and Kenneth Williams and Hattie Jakes. And you've also got people like Kenneth Connor and Ted Ray, who'd been in Carry On Teacher together, who'd done loads of radio together. So they'd all known each other pretty much anyway. They'd been doing sort of, I don't know, summer seasons or you know, radio shows or telly shows together. So as a gang of actors, they knew each other's work. But, you know, over the course of those 20 years, when, you know, most of them did most of them, they really did gel as a well, you know, honed comedy collective. And, yeah. Sergeants, as you say, hits the floor running. They just look so at ease together. You know, even the ones that don't do many. I mean, Gerald Campion did it, who was Billy Bunter on TV. He's only in the very first one, but he's pretty good. He works well in it, you know. But the guys that did stand the course, people like Kenneth Williams and Kenneth Connor, although they missed some, were in the very first one and the very last of the original run, Emmanuel, in 78. So to bridge 20 years of doing these things, you know, no wonder they got a bit frustrated with them. But
plus stage shows.
Plus stage shows and telly and all that, yeah, absolutely. But also, clever producers would cast them in like summer seasons. They would do things like Stop It Nurse in Torquay in the late 60s, and they'd get Bernard Breslau and Charles Hawtrey and Kenneth Connor together. You think, oh my God, it's like half the Carry On team. You know, you can eat some candy floss and get some fish and chips and see some Carry On people on the same day. I mean, it's one of my most thrilling days of my life. Where they did a thing called What a Carry On in Blackpool in 1992, and I just purposely went to Blackpool to see this thing because it was Bernard Breslau and Barbara Windsor together doing this unofficial Carry On thing. And it was gloriously rubbish, but just had the best time anyway.
I even think like casting William Hartnell in this is quite a, you know, it's quite a clever move. I mean, he's already very well established as an actor in these kinds of parts. So when you take someone from that's already, I suppose, a star in a very sort of loose sense of thing, you stick him into this little world. It does give you a sort of expectation and allows the humour to play. But you forget he was a massive star in sort of between the wars. I mean, late 30s, early 30s. He was doing sort of pretty much James Cagney style stuff in British films. He was a big star, and then he became a character actor as things like the Way Ahead and those sort of things. He became the go-to person to play sergeants, basically. And because I mentioned before the Army Game, he was playing the sergeant in the Army Game. So he was, as you say, it was a shorthand, really. You know, people knew Kenneth Williams from radio comedy. They knew Charles Hawtrey from the Will Hay films. You know, they'd already got their types already sort of down pat. So you stick them all in one film, and it's instant comedy. You know, Kenneth Connor was well loved. He would guest on the Goon Show and that sort of thing. But a go-to brilliant comedy voice man. You know, so they weren't stars as such, but they were certainly familiar people. It was just beautifully cast, and then they just kept coming back for more for 15, 20 years, depending on how long they could stick it. But yeah. Let's talk about Columbus, seeing as you've mentioned it.
Okay,
it's a film I'm actually very fond of. I think I've probably told you that before.
I'm fond of it too. Yeah, we bonded over it. I think we're the last two survivors who actually liked it. I think. What do you want to talk about, Columbus? Well, in what respect?
I mean, I mean, at some point they're going to have to stick it out on a proper DVD for a start.
I'm very keen to do that. I mean, because it's a rubbishy version out there now. The problem with Columbus is it's the orphan carry-on. So it's made by Island World. The only one that Peter Rogers didn't produce, he exec produced it. But John Goldstone, who'd done Monty Python's Life of Brian and the Peter Cook, Dudley Moore, Hound of the Baskervilles, he produced it. And I mean, it's interesting. The problem was, I think I said at the time, and I certainly said in various books, there's just so much baggage in that film. 14 years is a long time to go without. Sorry, it's a carry on. 14 years is a long time with no carry on at all. And when you think that the TV shows, and there were stage shows from 1958 through to 1978, I mean, there was at least one film a year, sometimes two, sometimes three. There were films that weren't carry-ons that were made by Gerald Thomas and Peter Rogers and starred some of the team. So there's things like The Big Job, which is Sid James, Joan Sims, Jim Dale. There's Raising the Wind, which is Kenneth Williams, Leslie Phillips, Liz Fraser. There were carry-on style comedies in between the carry-ons. So it was a blanket. And don't forget, they were on TV as well. So from the late 70s, they were on TV a lot. And then suddenly, obviously, a lot of the team had died as well. And a lot of the team didn't want to come back. The survivors didn't want to come back to do Columbus. And they were certainly offered some parts. Not particularly good parts, but they were offered some parts. So it had a lot to live up to.
This is the problem with franchises and with any kind of established brand like that. When you try and revitalize it, there is this temptation. You've got to kind of pay homage to the past. You've got to kind of reference it because there's an existing fan base that's there, but you've got to do something new with it as well.
Which they tried to do. And I think in some respects it worked really well. I think someone like Rick Mayall, for example, God bless him, who is superb in it. And I think Julian Clary works really well in it too. Others, No Names, No Pack Drill, are less good in it from the young guys. Jim Dale, for me, just holds the whole thing together like beautiful carry-on cement. I mean, he is just fabulous in it. But other than that, I mean, it's a tricky one. As you say, you've got to pay tribute to the past. Maybe they did a bit too much of that. Or maybe not enough. Maybe they just fell between the two stools.
It's an odd one because, I mean, for me, thinking about it and watching it, Jim Dale is very definitely the old carry-on that's there in it.
Yeah.
You've got other people like Leslie Phillips and John
Bernard Cribbins is quite big. I mean, Bernard Cribbins got a decent part. No, but again, because Cribbins hadn't done one since 1964. So it's not even. And as you said before, the ones that were on TV a lot of the times were the later ones. So the ones that Bernard Cribbins had made, he only made two: Carry On Jack, which was the very first historical one, and sort of like Spanish Armada sort of parody, sort of English naval thing, and Carry On Spying, which is a brilliant sort of spoof of James Bond, but done via sort of film noir. Really, it's more sort of Third Man and Casablanca than From Russia with Love, but it's a beautiful film. But he made those two films, nearly 30 years before Columbus. So unless you were like you and I, Robert, a sort of diehard, aficionados and had seen them all pretty much, then you wouldn't even know you'd been in them. Probably.
But is this not that perception as well that people have this idea about what a carry-on is, and I think they lump a lot of those kind of British comedians together. So someone like Frankie Hard, who was apparently originally cast in this and died just before
he did indeed
filming started.
He was going to play the King of Spain. Yeah,
I mean Frankie's only in a couple of films in the carry-on season, in the carry-on franchise anyway.
Sure.
So in some respects he's an odd choice to have.
But also, as you say, people get confused what carry-ons are.
It's obviously all about Pompeii, isn't it?
Pompeii is written by Tolkien Rothbard, so it is very much carry-on anyway. And he also was very hot in 1992. I use that phrase. I was a Frankie Panky, I'll have you know, because I was at university when he did that last sort of 2 or 3 years of live routines, and I saw him at least 6 times at the Lyric Hammersmith in 1990. He was suddenly reclaimed by the nation's youth and lauded and celebrated by the likes of Ben Elton and those sort of young guys. So Frankie Howard was very much almost like a contemporary, colossus. He also had the benefit of and done a couple
a really
in the
good
past.
choice for a
perfect choice.
Bridging actor.
I mean, death, you swine! How dare you come along? I mean, it's very sad because Jim Dale obviously was based in America as he is now, but he was certainly based in America then, having done Barnum on Broadway and all those sort of things. So he'd learned and sort of rehearsed those lines with the King of Spain with Frankie Howard in mind, because him and Frank were good pals and they had the same agent at one point. So but it was Leslie Phillips who came in at the last minute. But again, Leslie Phillips hadn't done one since 1959. You think, crying out loud. I mean, no one remembers Leslie Phillips being in the Carry-Ons, but he'd done the Doctor films. So again, they were produced by Peter Rogers' wife, Betty Box, and directed by Gerald Thomas's brother, Rafe Thomas. So they were very much Carry-On in feel as well. But I mean, it was, as I say, I do love Columbus. I had issues with it at the time because I think I was younger and, more demanding in those days, and I was so excited about it. But having watched it again, obviously several times over the years, it does give a lot of pleasure. I mean, it's not the best made film in the world. It was made in 4 weeks, which was the quickest they ever took to do a Carry-On. It was usually 6 weeks, sometimes 8 weeks if they had a push, but to do a film in 4 weeks, oh my life! I mean, seriously. But it sort of shows the fact that it was also Gerald Thomas's last film. He passed away the year later. There's lots of things that are wrong with it, but I do take a lot out of it, and I love it. Yeah.
So I asked this for a reason. So before I get back to Rob, because you can see, I did tell you, Rachel, Rob knows his stuff, and walking encyclopedia.
I'm learning so much.
I told you I would talk too much. You can put a mask around my face now.
So there's always talk of, considering these franchises are something that have perceptions, and they always talk about them kind of coming back. Carry-On is one of those franchises that endlessly they talk about bringing back in. Now, as someone who's not an aficionado,
yes,
what's your perception of that, and what would you expect from a modern day Carry-On, and what would you want from one, or would you even want one?
That's a really good question, and I wish I'd had time to think about an answer for this.
That's not how this works. I've done these long enough.
Okay, so I think, just off the top of my head, I just feel like we're in the era of reboots at the minute, where a lot of franchises are being revived, but they're being revived with that kind of "we're so much cooler these days" spin on them. I'm thinking about the likes of Superman, I'm thinking about the likes of Batman, I'm thinking about all of these sort of beloved franchises that are associated with sort of 1960s camp to a certain extent. So could one do, and this is going to sound like a ridiculous phrase, but a straight Carry-On revival at this stage?
Arguably, I mean, if you go, this is part of the reason as well for picking Sergeant, is where we started on this conversation today. When you look back at those earlier films, they are somewhat straighter than I think most people's perceptions.
No, I agree, but do people perceive that as being Carry-On?
Do you mean that, can you do a straight Carry-On, as in, can you do like a 1971 Carry-On?
Yeah, basically. The Carry-On that people think of, the Barbara Windsor with the bra.
I think you get away with some of those. There are some horrendous jokes in there. I mean, I do a live show. I tour anywhere that pays me with a show about the Carry-Ons, and I get a lot of people who are pure, just like blind faith Carry-On, nutters who love it. But I do try and address the homophobic stuff in it, which there's not as much as there's a lot of racism stuff in that gets in. There's an awful lot of misogyny that gets in, and I do address it, and I get like sort of gasps of like sort of hatred from some people. I was like, you've got to acknowledge it, but they do get away with it somehow because they're on TV still. Now you would never dream of getting stuff like Benny Hill on, who that's another show you can talk about, but they don't show Benny Hill. They do not show Dick Henry. They will not show an Enough Otmum. But they do show the Carry-Ons. And they show the Carry-Ons for the very good reason that they've never been off television. And they've almost like, they get away with those off-colour jokes somehow. But what would happen, I think, if they did them now, you would do, like you mentioned, Robert, that you reflect the time. They all reflect their time. Sergeant is very much a 1958 film, which is a lovely film to watch, but it's rooted in 1958. Carry On Screaming, although it's an Edwardian sort of parody of the Hammer horror film, is very much set in 1966. So they are of their period. So if you did one in 2019, it would have to be about 2019 and have the mentality of 2019, but with innuendos in it. So you do, but you can do. the Prince songs have got innuendo in them. They're still
Brexit
great.
with
They're
innuendo.
still great art. They're still great art. Don't mention you mentioned the B word. I'm going back there next week. I want to say here anyway. But
Not here, you don't.
No. Worse is here. Yeah. So I've been in Ireland as well. I'm Northern Ireland. But I love Northern Ireland. But anyway, it's another story. What was I going to say? Yes. So the point is, I think you would. There's an essence of Carry On that goes through all of those 31 films and the TV shows. There's an essence to it, and it's in the performance. They're larger than life, but brilliantly played. So you've got to cast really good comedy actors. You've got to have some sort of smutty, titter behind the hand sort of comedy. But if you did it in 2019, you'd have to sort of address that and not do a sort of a send up of that, but do it in a certain sort of like postmodern irony sort of way.
So that's what I was going to ask about, because that innuendo and that kind of smutty joke thing is very much of its time and very much about what you could get away with at the time.
Yeah.
Whereas these days, you can drop the F-bomb and still barely get a 12A certificate.
Yeah, sure. It's different times.
And we have a thing called torture porn now. So I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that the screen is just drenched in smut and gore these days. So it's a very different kind of expectations from the audience. That kind of almost gentler approach to we've got to laugh behind our hands because we can't get away with saying Willie.
But yeah, exactly. Well, you just did. Look at that.
I did, yes.
Because
it's 2019, you see.
Exactly. You can say what you like.
Yeah.
But I think the point is that because the old carry-ons are on TV still, as I mentioned before, that they haven't gone away. So that comedy is like a little sort of time capsule from a saucier age, really. And I think you've got to be careful to do that. To let's say you remake one. Let's say you just grab Carry On Camping and remake it word for word with obviously a different cast because they're all gone, most of them. You couldn't do that because those jokes coming out of a 2019 comedy actor's mouth just would not work. They only work if you watch it in a 1968 context and it's Sid James and Bernard Breslau doing it. I don't know. Don't ask me why, but it works in that historical context, and you almost take it out of the archives and you run it, and it's okay if you have the mentality to unpick it and see why it works. But to try and do Carry On Camping verbatim in 2019 would be a disaster.
But that kind of, I mean, you sort of referenced it earlier on when you talk about the sort of the theatrical productions that these guys are involved in outside maybe the Carry On world. That kind of slightly saucy seaside theatre touring productions that go on. I mean, a lot of those plays are still performed up and down the country today.
Absolutely.
And they're still getting good audiences. So, I mean, is there still a market for that
there
stuff?
is. But I'm obviously, as you know, my girlfriend's an actor, and we tour all around the place, and we do see certain shows that are almost billed as a combination of dirty rugby songs and a Carry On film. I mean,
it's still 1955 somewhere.
It is, absolutely. Yes. Croydon. No, it's not. But but it is, and I think they do work. But a live thing is different. Now, Torwart Rothwell, who wrote what I suppose would consider the most famous Carry-ons, like Carry On Doctor and Camping and Up the Khyber and all those, as well as Up Pompeii, he actually thought it wouldn't work on TV because he saw Carry On as a filmic thing. But because it worked on TV, then obviously, loads of those 70s sitcoms would either inject Carry On people into them, like, Sid James into Bless His House, or they would be sort of quite smutty, Ain't Off Hot Mum sort of stuff, or Are You Being Served sort of stuff, which, just ran with all the smut. But I think on stage it works because you're in a different situation, and you can run an old Ray Cooney farce and almost set it in 1962 on the stage, and you can get away with it, and chuck a couple of old sitcom actors in for marquee value, and you've got a runway, half week sort of tour the country sort of thing. But it's film is a different thing, and as you said, it really can be a tricky beast to get right. Particularly if you resurrect now, I mentioned before about the gap between Emmanuel and Columbus was 14 years. It's now 27 years since Columbus,
and they're still talking about doing it. Yeah. So I mean, it's so for anyone who's not aware of this, Robert, your name has been attached to Carry On London.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Which is
whatever
version, whatever has passed for that title now. I mean, they've been talking about doing this since at least the early 2000s under that title.
2003 was
Britney Spears at one point associated with this? I seem to recall.
Everybody else was. There was a point when, it's a tricky one.
It looked like a few years ago, once again, this was very close to happening. I keep on looking at this in terms of sort of my own area, so we've
been friends a long time, so I mean, you've known the ins and outs of this over the last 6-7 years or so, haven't you? So I mean,
so I don't want to kind of go into all that stuff.
No, not all that. No, I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about the logistics of
folks. It's interesting.
We'll do the X-rated version of this later. The logistics of getting it done. I mean, you know that the pre-production life of any film is torturous, but this is so torturous. But yeah, I mean, but it's always been the case. They were talking about in the 80s about doing them. There's never been a time when they've not talked about doing carry-ons in those gaps. And the crazy thing is, we're now 61 years since Carry On Sergeant. We are 41 years since Emmanuel. There's been one film in 41 years, and we're still talking about it. It
says a lot about the brand. I mean, the brand itself is a good, solid brand that obviously still has an interest, and there's an audience out there for it. It's just how you then develop it and keep it alive. And is it something that at this stage, obviously, you can't really comment on this because you're sort of involved with it. But I mean, is it something that people see just as a heritage thing now, or is it something that actually still has life?
Going concern. Going concern. But with I always look at it. My great pitch is it's got to have one foot in 1962 and one foot in 2019. It's got to have the history of it. That's why do it. You might as well just do a comedy film and call it something else. If you're going to call a thing Carry On, you've got to pay respect to the fallen, really, for want of a better phrase. And you cannot make a Carry On without acknowledging the work of particularly the main cast that a general audience will know and love, the Kenneth Williams and Hattie Jakes and Joan Sims and Terry Scott and Peter Butterworth and all these glorious people that made that team work, but also the two chief writers, Norman Hoodis and Tom Rothwell, and particularly the director Gerald Thomas. You just can't not acknowledge those people. So there will be little references and things, but not too many, not to sort of like sink it in mud. It's like, but why does every franchise that comes back? Why does Star Wars put the old guys in, and why does Ghostbusters put the old guys in? Because they want to be seen. Because fans out there want to see Dan Aykroyd in Ghostbusters, even if it's just one beautiful little cameo at the end. That gives you a joyous kick. So if you're going to do Carry On whatever, if there's anybody left by the time we actually get around to doing it, and we had a pretty bad year last year, bless, and we lost a lot last year. You of course you'd want Jim Dale to pop up there somewhere, wouldn't you? I mean, that's why do it. But
you've got to get a daffodil between somebody's arse cheeks.
That's going to happen tonight. That's regardless of the Carry On film. I'm on that later. But
this is audio only. How do we know we don't have daffodils?
Exactly. Yes, I know.
Just follow on Twitter.
I've got a good view of this. I can see what's going on down there. Anyway, no, but seriously, folks, it's got to get smutty at some point. I think, as I say, you can't do it unless you reference the history of Carry On. And as you said, Robert, the franchise is so strong still. If you say Carry On to anybody, they've got an idea what it is, be it incorrect or not. They've got a basic concept of what you should have in that film. So if you don't deliver that, they won't come back for the second one or the 33rd one.
Are we including all the documentary type things and the compilations?
No, there's 31 features. So the next one will be Carry On 32. That feature films. But there was a series of sitcoms in the mid 70s called Carry On Laughing, which was different from the compilation show of the same name. There are 4 Carry On Christmases, plus a fifth one if you like, a sort of compilation called Carry On Laughing's Christmas Classics, which Kenneth Williams and Barbara Windsor hosted in 1983. So there's loads of stuff, I mean, there's novelizations of there's continuations of the films in novel form. There's all sorts of crazy stuff. You can buy Carry On Camping salad servers and Carry On Henry poker chips and
toss your own salad with Carry On.
Oh, you certainly can, darling.
There you go. Look how pleased he is with his face.
My cottage is full of nonsense. I've got little bobblehead Sid Jameses and all sorts of terrible tat. I mean, they were branded. They were a franchise. They weren't, as you said, it's one-off film. Once you got the second one, once you got a series going, they really went for it and they really sold it, and internationally too. Most countries would acknowledge Carry On. You can go on eBay and find loads of foreign language posters for all the Carry Ons, and they did do really well. They still do. They're shown on TV all around the world. So it's big business.
Oh, and that's whetted some people's appetites.
That's what she said.
Robert, anything
I didn't do one of those jokes all the way through. I was really well paid.
That's The Office. Rob, which of your books should people be buying? Because there are many.
All of them.
There are many. Which are still in print at present?
Yeah, well, the first one I wrote, I think is out of print now, but was the Carry On Companion, which I wrote in 1996, which is, a long time ago.
I have that.
So thank you, darling. Which ran to 7 editions. I'll sign it later. I think probably the best one I did was called The Carry On Story, which was 2005, I think, which was the one I always wanted to do, which was the hardback sort of colour illustrations, and it was a fun one. That was for a now defunct publishing house called Reynolds and Hearn. But I've done other stuff on not Carry On as well.
I believe there's a bit coming out very soon, is there not? Forgotten Heroes of British Comedy.
Thank you. Not British comedy, Forgotten Heroes of Comedy. So there's international stuff in there too. It's mainly British, to be fair, and American, but a few other things as well. And that's been a labour of love I've been working on for 20 years with lovely Terry Jones. And so this quickly plug this idea, because I do a show about that as well, called Forgotten Heroes of Comedy. So go to my website, robertross.co.uk. You'll see the dates there. But I had an Indian, and Terry Jones, bless him, loves his booze and loves his Indian food, and I would spend a lot of time with him. We got very lashed one night, and we were playing his old collection of 78 records, RPM records, and he has this lovely collection of old musical acts, and he played a record by a guy called Ronald Franco, who was like a 1930s sort of quite smutty but sophisticated smutty comedian who I knew from research and whatever, and he was amazing. You can't know him, he's been dead for 50 years or something. I said, yeah, but I know him. He said, well, he's a forgotten hero. You should write a book called Forgotten Heroes of Comedy, and I'll write the foreword for you. And fast forward 20 years, because we couldn't get a publisher, frankly, but it's coming through Unbound, which is a sort of crowdfunding publisher, and it's finally coming out. I've now finished it. It's like that. It's like a scab I can't leave alone. I just keep on going back, and this with writing books, don't you, Rachel?
Oh, yes.
You just once you let it go into the wild, it's gone forever.
And that's when you do all of the best proofreading, and you find the commas and the apostrophes that you've missed.
Yeah. When you see that, when that first copy comes through the door, and you think, oh no, and people, friends. There's a friend of mine, bless him, Alan Coles, who delights in spotting the mistake. And it's not like you kids now with your websites, you can just change it and it's there. Okay, but once the book's out in the wild, it's done. But no, so it's finally done. It should be out either the end of this year or probably more likely next year now. But I've not wanted to rush it. It's been one of those joys to do. So that's a fun one. And then the other one I'm very proud of is about Marty Feldman, who I did a book about.
It's a very good book.
About 10 years ago now. Which was a delight, because I'm a huge fan of Marty, and there'd never been a book about him up to that point. And it became a play called Jeepers Creepers, and that's how I met my girlfriend, who played Loretta Feldman in it. So thanks, Marty. So it's been a funny old way to make a living, as John Fisher once said. But it's been a joy. So there we go.
And basically, you can also see you in anything that comes up on the telly box about carry-ons, and you're on Talking Pictures.
Talking Pictures, I do a regular sort of interview show, and there's more coming of those, I think, at some point. I'm basically the person they drag in for those, cheap and cheerful clip shows on a Christmas Eve on Channel 5. I'll pop up on those all the time, 50 funniest moments or whatever. But they're fun, and it's about the carry-ons as well. I wrote that first book purely because I got so annoyed and so miffed that mistakes were being made in reference books, and the carry-ons, love them or loathe them, they are important social comedy documents, and they were so mistreated and sort of looked down upon, really, by scholarly film books. And Halliwell's Filmgoer's Companion, which was my Bible, just gave the whole series like a little column about an inch long, and gave them 0 stars. All of them. They're not equal. Yeah. They are not all worth 0 stars. You know, Carry On Up the Khyber is clearly a much better film than Carry On England in every single way. You can't say they're all as good or as bad as each other. They are different films. So that got my goat. So that's why I sat down and wrote the first book. Purely to get it right, really. And it was, so I've been doing this lark for 23, 24 years now. So my dad's turning his grade now, saying he's still saying, get a proper job, get a proper job. Anyway,
Robert, thank you very much.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for asking me.
Rachel, have I convinced you that Carry-Ons are worth looking at a bit more?
Do you know, I'm going to have a look at a few more of them. I genuinely enjoyed Sergeant and Nurse, which was a complete surprise to me. So yeah, I'm going to look at a few more of them. Thank you, guys.
Pleasure.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Folks, thanks very much for listening. As per usual, you can find out more, interact with us. You can get us on Facebook, on Instagram. We're at CinePunked Film on Instagram. Everywhere else, we're at CinePunked. We're on Twitter. We've also got our podcast that you're listening to right now. Download it. Tell your friends. Share it away. Write some reviews. Say something nice.
Argue with us on Twitter.
We do like arguments, don't we?
We do like arguments. Well, you do.
I like arguments. So I've been Robert J. Simpson, joined as usual by Dr. Rachael Kelly.
Thank you.
Our special guest, Robert Ross.
Thank you very much.
And thanks once again to Ben Simpson for all his sterling work in making us sound halfway as tolerable. As he quietly.
You hope.
Honestly, we sound much better once he's involved. Folks, until the next time, see you soon.